I was scrolling through my phone on a Tuesday morning when I heard the first knock at my door, sharp and insistent, like someone was trying to wake the dead. I opened it to find a woman in her mid-40s standing on my porch, her highlighted blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, wearing a crisp white blouse and khaki capris that screamed suburban authority. Her face was already twisted into an expression of profound displeasure. "Can I help you?" I asked, coffee mug still in hand. "I'm Deborah Whitmore, president of the Sunset Meadows Homeowners Association," she announced, her voice dripping with the kind of self-importance that made my jaw clench. "Those solar panels you installed on your roof are absolutely hideous, and they need to come down immediately." I blinked at her, processing this ambush. "Excuse me." "You heard me correctly. Those panels are an eyesore and they're bringing down property values for the entire neighborhood. I've already received 3 complaints from other residents." She crossed her arms, her manicured nails tapping against her elbow. "You should have submitted an architectural review form before making such a drastic change to your home's exterior." I set my coffee down on the small table by my door and stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind me. "Deborah, is it? Look, I did my research before installing those panels. California state law specifically prohibits HOAs from preventing homeowners from installing solar panels. It's covered under the Solar Rights Act." Her eyes narrowed. "I don't care what some state law says. Our HOA has rules and regulations that every homeowner agreed to when they purchased their property. You signed those documents, Mr. Ashford, Frank Ashford," I said. "And yes, I read every page of those documents, but state law supersedes HOA rules when it comes to solar energy systems. You can't make me take them down." Deborah's face flushed red, creeping up from her neck to her cheeks. "We'll see about that. The Architectural Committee will be reviewing this matter at our next meeting, and I can assure you, we will be taking action." She turned on her heel and marched back down my driveway, her sensible flats clicking against the concrete with military precision. I watched her go, feeling the first stirrings of what I knew would become a long and exhausting battle. I had moved into Sunset Meadows 6 months ago, a planned community in Roseville, California, about 20 miles northeast of Sacramento. The neighborhood was beautiful, with its tree-lined streets and well-maintained homes, but I was quickly learning that beauty came with a price, and that price was dealing with people like Deborah Whitmore. I went back inside and immediately pulled up the California Civil Code on my laptop. Section 714.1 was clear as day. HOAs could impose reasonable restrictions on solar panel installations, but those restrictions couldn't significantly increase the cost or decrease the efficiency of the system. They couldn't prevent installation altogether. My panels were on my roof, barely visible from the street, and they were generating enough electricity to cut my power bill by 70%. There was no legitimate reason for the HOA to object. But I knew that logic and law didn't always matter when dealing with HOA boards drunk on their tiny slice of power. 3 days later, I received a certified letter in the mail. It was from the Sunset Meadows HOA, written in formal legal language that probably made Deborah feel very official. The letter stated that I was in violation of Section 8.3 of the community's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, which required all exterior modifications to be approved by the Architectural Committee before installation. It demanded that I remove the solar panels within 30 days or face daily fines of $100. I called my solar installation company that afternoon. The representative, a helpful guy named Marcus, listened to my situation and sighed. "Yeah, we see this kind of thing more often than you'd think," he said. HOAs hate solar panels because they think they are ugly, but the law is on your side. You might want to talk to a lawyer who specializes in HOA disputes. I spent the next 2 days researching attorneys in the Sacramento area. I finally settled on a firm called Brennan and Associates, run by a woman named Patricia Brennan, who had successfully handled several cases against overreaching HOAs. Her consultation fee was reasonable, and when I called, she was able to see me the following Monday. Patricia's office was in a modern building in downtown Sacramento, all glass and steel with a view of the Capitol building in the distance. She was in her early 50s, with gray-streaked dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Mr. Ashford, tell me about your situation," she said, gesturing for me to sit in one of the leather chairs across from her desk. I explained everything, from Deborah's initial visit to the threatening letter. Patricia listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "Do you have copies of your HOA's CCRs?" she asked when I finished. "Yes, and I brought them." I pulled out the thick stack of documents from my bag and handed them over. She flipped through them quickly, her eyes scanning the pages with practiced efficiency. "Okay, this is pretty standard stuff. The architectural review requirement is common, but it doesn't override state law. California Civil Code 714.1 is very clear. Your HOA can impose reasonable restrictions, but they can't prevent you from installing solar panels, and they can't require you to remove panels that are already installed, especially if those panels are functioning properly and weren't installed in a way that violates building codes." "So what do I do about the fine they're threatening?" I asked. "First, we send them a letter explaining the law and making it clear that their attempted restrictions are illegal. We'll cite the relevant statutes and explain that if they continue to pursue this matter, you'll have grounds for a lawsuit. We'll also mention that under California law, if you prevail in that lawsuit, they'll be liable for your attorney's fees. Will that be enough to make them back off?" Patricia leaned back in her chair. "It depends on how stubborn your HOA board is. Some boards realize they're in the wrong and quietly drop the matter. Others dig in their heels because they don't like being told what to do. From what you've described about this Deborah Whitmore, I'm guessing she's the type to dig in." She was right. Patricia sent the letter on Tuesday. By Thursday, I had another certified letter from the HOA, this time signed by both Deborah and the HOA's attorney, a man named Gerald Hopkins. The letter acknowledged receipt of Patricia's correspondence, but maintained that the HOA had the right to enforce its architectural standards. It also stated that the daily fines would begin accruing as of the original 30-day deadline. "They're bluffing," Patricia told me when I called her in a panic. "They can't legally fine you for this. Keep a record of everything they send you, but don't pay them a dime." The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock. The meetings were held in the community center, a pleasant building near the neighborhood's main entrance with a large meeting room and a small kitchen. I had never attended one before. I hadn't seen much point when all I wanted to do was live peacefully in my house and not deal with neighborhood politics. But this situation had forced my hand. I arrived 10 minutes early to find about 20 other residents already there, sitting in folding chairs arranged in neat rows facing a table at the front of the room. Deborah sat in the center chair, flanked by 4 other board members. I recognized one of them, a balding man in his 60s named Tom something who lived 3 houses down from me. The others were strangers. I took a seat in the back row, trying to be inconspicuous. The meeting started promptly at 7, with Deborah banging a gavel on the table like she was a judge presiding over a murder trial. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting of the Sunset Meadows Homeowners Association to order. First on our agenda is the approval of last month's minutes. The meeting dragged through standard business, budget reports, landscaping contracts, complaints about dog waste not being picked up. I was starting to think maybe they weren't going to bring up my solar panels when Deborah cleared her throat and pulled out a folder. Now we come to new business. As many of you may have noticed, one of our residents has installed solar panels on his roof without obtaining proper approval from the architectural committee. These panels are visible from the street and represent a significant departure from the aesthetic standards our community has worked hard to maintain. Several heads turned to look around the room, trying to figure out who she was talking about. I raised my hand. "That would be me," I said, standing up. "Frank Ashford, 482 Willow Creek Drive." Deborah's smile was thin and cold. "Mr. Ashford, yes, would you care to explain why you felt it was appropriate to bypass our established procedures?" "I didn't bypass anything," I said, keeping my voice level. "I installed solar panels on my roof, which is my legal right under California state law. The Civil Code specifically prohibits HOAs from preventing solar panel installation. The law requires you to work with the HOA to find a mutually agreeable solution," Deborah shot back. "You didn't even attempt to get approval." "I shouldn't need approval for something that's protected by state law, and besides, the panels are barely visible from the street. They're on the back slope of my roof." A woman in the third row raised her hand. "I live across the street from Mr. Ashford, and I can see his panels from my upstairs window. They're very noticeable." "Thank you, Linda," Deborah said warmly. "You see, Mr. Ashford, your panels are affecting other residents' enjoyment of their properties." "With all due respect," I said, my patience wearing thin, "what you can see from your upstairs window while standing in your own private home is not the HOA's concern. The law says I can have these panels. I've consulted with an attorney who specializes in HOA law, and she's confirmed that your attempted restrictions are illegal." The room erupted in murmurs. Deborah banged her gavel again. "Order! Mr. Ashford, this board takes its responsibilities very seriously. We have rules for a reason. If we let one person do whatever they want, soon everyone will be painting their houses purple or parking RVs in their driveways. That's a false equivalency, and you know it," I said. "Solar panels aren't a frivolous aesthetic choice. They're an investment in renewable energy, and they save money on electricity bills. The state of California encourages their use. That's why the law protects homeowners' rights to install them." Tom, the board member I recognized, leaned forward. "Look, Frank, I get where you're coming from. But we've got to have some standards. What if everyone starts putting up panels? The neighborhood will start looking like some kind of industrial park. Then the neighborhood will be doing its part to combat climate change and reduce dependence on fossil fuels," I replied. "Which seems like a good thing to me." Deborah's face was approaching the color of a ripe tomato. "This board will not be lectured about environmental policy by someone who can't be bothered to follow simple community guidelines. I move that we uphold the fine schedule outlined in our previous correspondence to Mr. Ashford. All in favor?" 4 hands went up immediately. Only one board member, a younger woman in her 30s, abstained. "Motion carries," Deborah announced with obvious satisfaction. "Mr. Ashford, you now owe this association $100 per day starting from the deadline specified in our letter, which was 3 days ago. That's $300 so far, and the amount will continue to accumulate until you remove those panels or reach a compromise with the architectural committee." "I won't be paying any fines," I said firmly. And I won't be removing the panels. You're violating state law, and if you continue down this path, I will sue this HOA and I will win. When that happens, you'll be liable for my attorney's fees, which will cost the association a lot more than whatever petty satisfaction you're getting from this power trip. I walked out before Deborah could respond, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't naturally confrontational, but something about the sheer arbitrary injustice of the situation had lit a fire in me. I had done nothing wrong. I had invested thousands of dollars in making my home more energy efficient, and these people were treating me like I'd committed some kind of crime. When I got home, I immediately emailed Patricia a summary of what had happened at the meeting. She called me back within an hour. "They actually voted to uphold the fines?" she asked, sounding almost impressed. "Okay, they've left us no choice. We're going to file a lawsuit. I'll draw up the paperwork tomorrow." "How long will this take?" I asked. "Could be a few months before we get a court date, depending on the judge's schedule. But in the meantime, I'm going to file for a preliminary injunction to stop them from collecting those fines. With the law this clearly on your side, I'm confident we'll get it." "And how much is this going to cost me?" Patricia was quiet for a moment. "I'll be honest with you, Frank. Legal fees can add up quickly. But like I said, if we win, which I'm very confident we will, the HOA has to pay your attorney's fees. You'll be made whole. And if we somehow lose?" "We won't. The law is black and white on this. I've handled a dozen cases like this, and I've won every single one." Her confidence was reassuring, but I still felt a knot of anxiety in my stomach as I hung up. I had never sued anyone before. I had never even been involved in any kind of legal dispute. Now I was going to war with my own neighborhood association over something that should have been completely straightforward. The next few weeks were tense. I kept receiving increasingly aggressive letters from the HOA, each one adding another $100 per day to my supposed debt. The total quickly climbed into the thousands. Deborah also started filing complaints with the county about my property, claiming various code violations that didn't actually exist. I had to take time off work to meet with county inspectors who came out, looked at my perfectly legal and properly installed solar panels, and left shaking their heads at the obvious harassment. "This is retaliatory," one inspector told me, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Rodriguez. "We see it sometimes with HOA disputes. They'll file bogus complaints hoping something sticks. Just document everything." I was documenting everything. I had a thick folder full of letters, emails, and certified mail receipts. I took photos of county inspector visits. I even started recording conversations when Deborah showed up at my house, which she did with increasing frequency. One particularly memorable visit happened on a Saturday morning. I was in my garage working on organizing some boxes when I heard her voice behind me. "Mr. Ashford, we need to talk." I turned to find Deborah standing at the end of my driveway, accompanied by Linda, the neighbor who had complained at the meeting, and another woman I didn't recognize. "Unless you're here to apologize and drop the fines, I don't think we have anything to discuss," I said. "Don't be childish," Deborah snapped. "We're trying to reach a reasonable compromise. What if you moved the panels to a different part of your roof where they'd be less visible?" "My installer placed them where they'd get maximum sun exposure," I explained for what felt like the 100th time. "Moving them would reduce their efficiency, which state law says you can't require me to do." "What if we had them painted to match your roof color?" Linda suggested. "That way they'd blend in better. Painting them would also reduce their efficiency. The panels need to be dark to absorb sunlight effectively. This isn't complicated." The third woman, who still hadn't introduced herself, spoke up. You're being incredibly selfish. Don't you care about how your choices affect the rest of us? My husband and I are trying to sell our house, and our realtor says potential buyers are being turned off by your panels. If that's true, which I doubt, those buyers are idiots, I said flatly. Solar panels increase property values. There's plenty of research showing that. How dare you call people idiots? The woman sputtered. I didn't call people idiots. I said if they're turned off by solar panels, they're idiots. There's a difference. Deborah held up her hand. This is getting us nowhere. Mr. Ashford, the board is prepared to offer you a compromise. Remove the panels, and we'll waive the fines you've accrued so far. We'll even agree not to oppose a future installation if you submit proper plans to the architectural committee and work with us to find a mutually acceptable design. No, I said simply. The panels stay. I'm not removing something I legally installed just because you think they're ugly, and I'm definitely not going to beg your permission to reinstall them later. Then you leave us no choice but to continue pursuing the fines, Deborah said. And I can promise you, this association will use every resource at our disposal to make sure you comply with our rules. Threaten me all you want, I replied. My lawyer is filing a lawsuit next week. See you in court. They left in a huff, and I went back to my boxes, but my hands were shaking. I hated confrontation. I hated drama. All I had wanted was to reduce my carbon footprint and save some money on electricity. Now I was in the middle of a neighborhood war. Patricia filed the lawsuit the following Tuesday, along with a motion for a preliminary injunction. The HOA was served with papers on Thursday. On Friday, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, a man's voice greeted me. Mr. Ashford, this is Gerald Hopkins, attorney for the Sunset Meadows HOA. I was hoping we could have a conversation about this situation before things get any more contentious. What kind of conversation? I asked warily. A pragmatic one. Look, I've reviewed your case, and I've advised the board about the relevant state laws. Between you and me, I think they're on shaky ground here. But they're my clients, and they feel very strongly about this issue. I'm wondering if there's any way we can reach a settlement that avoids costly litigation. Your clients have been harassing me for weeks, I said. They've filed false complaints with the county. They've threatened me with thousands of dollars in fines, and your board president shows up at my house every few days to berate me. What kind of settlement could possibly be acceptable after all that? Hopkins sighed. What if the board agreed to drop all fines and formally acknowledged your right to keep the solar panels, and in exchange, you agreed to plant some strategic landscaping that would partially screen the panels from street view? Why would I agree to that? I don't need to compromise. The law is on my side. You're right, the law probably is on your side, but litigation is expensive and time-consuming, even when you win. Wouldn't it be easier for everyone if we could resolve this amicably? I thought about it for a moment. Part of me was tempted to accept just to make the whole nightmare go away. But another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger and angrier with each HOA letter and each confrontation with Deborah, wasn't willing to give an inch. No, I said finally. I'm not planting landscaping. I don't want just to appease people who have been acting like petty tyrants. If the board wants to drop the fines and issue a formal apology, I'll consider not pursuing damages for harassment. Otherwise, we'll let a judge sort it out. That's unfortunate, Hopkins said. I'll relay your position to my clients. He hung up, and I immediately called Patricia to tell her about the conversation. Good, she said when I finished. You handled that exactly right. They're scrambling because they know they're going to lose. Hopkins is a decent attorney. He wouldn't have made that call unless he'd told the board they were in trouble, and they didn't want to hear it. So what happens next? We've got a hearing on the preliminary injunction scheduled for 3 weeks from now. I'll need you to be there to testify if necessary, but it should be pretty straightforward. After that, assuming we get the injunction, we'll move toward a trial date, though honestly, I think there's a good chance they'll settle before it gets that far. The 3 weeks crawled by. Deborah continued her campaign of petty harassment, finding new and creative ways to make my life difficult. She filed a complaint that my trash cans were visible from the street on non-collection days, which wasn't true. She claimed my lawn was overgrown, which it wasn't. She even tried to argue that my car was parked too far into the street, which was physically impossible given the dimensions of my driveway. Each complaint required me to respond with photos and documentation, proving that I wasn't in violation of anything. It was exhausting and infuriating. I started to understand why some people just gave up and moved when dealing with tyrannical HOAs. The constant stress was affecting my sleep and my work performance, but I wasn't going to give up, partly out of principle and partly out of sheer stubborn spite. Deborah Whitmore was not going to win this fight. The hearing for the preliminary injunction was held in Sacramento County Superior Court on a Wednesday morning in late October. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly washed out. Patricia and I sat at one table while Hopkins and Deborah sat at the other. Deborah kept shooting me hostile looks, which I ignored. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Margaret Chen. She had a reputation, Patricia had told me, for being no-nonsense and not tolerating frivolous arguments. Patricia presented our case first, walking Judge Chen through the relevant sections of California Civil Code and explaining how the HOA's attempted restrictions violated state law. She entered my solar panel installation permits and inspection reports as evidence, showing that everything had been done properly and legally. Hopkins then stood to present the HOA's argument. Your Honor, the Sunset Meadows HOA is not attempting to prevent Mr. Ashford from using solar energy. We simply believe that his installation could have been done in a way that was less visually intrusive to the surrounding neighborhood. Our CCRs clearly state that all exterior modifications require architectural committee approval, and Mr. Ashford bypassed that process entirely. Counsel, Judge Chen interrupted, are you familiar with Civil Code Section 714.1? Yes, Your Honor. Then you're aware that HOAs cannot prevent solar panel installation and cannot impose restrictions that significantly decrease the system's efficiency or increase its cost. We're not trying to prevent installation, Your Honor. We're simply asking that it be done in a way consistent with community standards. And what specifically about Mr. Ashford's installation violates those standards? Hopkins hesitated. The panels are visible from neighboring properties and from the street. Are they on the roof? Yes, Your Honor. Are they mounted in a way that's consistent with standard solar installation practices? I believe so, yes. Then what exactly is the problem, counsel? The statute specifically protects homeowners' rights to install solar panels on their roofs. It doesn't include an exception for HOAs that think they are ugly. I had to suppress a smile. Deborah looked like she was about to explode. Hopkins tried a few more arguments, but Judge Chen wasn't having any of it. After about 15 minutes, she cut him off. I've heard enough. The preliminary injunction is granted. The Sunset Meadows HOA is hereby enjoined from collecting any fines related to Mr. Ashford's solar panel installation, and from taking any further action to compel him to remove or modify those panels. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to cease any retaliatory conduct directed at Mr. Ashford. That means no more harassment, No more baseless code complaints, nothing. If I hear that this has continued, I will hold the board members personally in contempt. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Honor," Hopkins said quietly. Deborah's face had gone from red to pale. "Good. We'll set a trial date for January to resolve the underlying issues and determine damages. Counsel, file a joint proposed scheduling order by next Friday." The gavel came down, and the hearing was over. Patricia and I walked out of the courtroom together, and I felt like a massive weight had been lifted off my shoulders. "That went well," Patricia said with a satisfied smile. "Judge Chen basically told them they had no case." "You think they'll actually go to trial?" I asked, doubtful. "Hopkins knows they're going to lose, and now his clients have heard a judge tell them the same thing. I expect we'll get a settlement offer within the next few weeks." She was right. 10 days later, Hopkins called with a new proposal. The HOA would drop all fines, issue a formal letter acknowledging my right to maintain the solar panels, and agree to pay $15,000 toward my attorney's fees. In exchange, I would agree not to pursue any further damages. I talked it over with Patricia. "The $15,000 doesn't cover all my fees," she explained, "but it covers most of them. And it saves you the stress and time of going through a full trial. It's not a bad offer, considering." "What about damages for the harassment?" I asked. "We could pursue that, but it's harder to quantify." "Emotional distress claims are tricky, and you'd have to prove actual damages beyond just being annoyed and stressed out. The judge might award something, but it might not be much, and it would take months to get to trial." I thought about it. Part of me wanted to drag the HOA through a full trial just to make them suffer the way they'd made me suffer. But the practical part of me recognized that the offer was reasonable, and accepting it would let me move on with my life. "Tell them I'll accept on one condition," I said. "Deborah Whitmore has to personally sign the letter acknowledging my rights, and she has to resign from the HOA board." Patricia laughed. "That's probably not going to happen." "Then no deal. She made this personal. She needs to face consequences." Patricia called Hopkins back and presented my counteroffer. There was a long negotiation, with multiple calls back and forth over the next week. Eventually, they agreed to everything except the resignation. The best they would offer was that Deborah would step down as board president, though she could remain as a regular board member. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was something. I accepted. The settlement was finalized in mid-November. I received a formal letter from the Sunset Meadows HOA, signed by Deborah Whitmore, acknowledging that my solar panel installation was legal, and that the association would not take any further action against me regarding the panels. The letter also included an apology for any inconvenience caused by the dispute. The apology was clearly written by Hopkins rather than Deborah, but I didn't care. It was in writing, and that was what mattered. The HOA cut a check for $15,000, which Patricia applied to my legal fees. I ended up owing her another $3,000 out of pocket, which hurt but was manageable. At the next HOA meeting, which I attended just to witness the moment, Deborah announced her resignation as board president. She gave a brief speech about wanting to spend more time on other commitments, but everyone in the room knew the real reason. Tom was elected as the new president. He seemed like a reasonable enough guy, and in his first official statement, he said the board would be reviewing all policies to ensure they were in compliance with state law. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. About 3 weeks after the settlement was finalized, I came home from work to find my garage door had been spray painted with the words "Solar Snitch" in ugly red letters. My mailbox had also been knocked over, lying in the grass with its post snapped in half. I called the police and filed a report. The officer who responded, a young guy named Martinez, took photos and asked if I had any idea who might have done it. "I've got a pretty good suspicion," I said, and explained the whole HOA saga. "Did anyone specifically threaten you?" he asked. "Not in so many words, but there's been a lot of hostility. Without direct evidence, there's not much we can do. Could have been teenagers, but I'll file the report, and if it happens again, we'll take it more seriously." I had security cameras installed the next day. They were expensive, but after everything I'd been through, I wasn't taking any chances. 2 weeks later, the cameras paid off. At 2 in the morning, they captured footage of Deborah's husband, a stocky man in his 50s named Richard, walking up my driveway and dumping a bag of dog feces on my front porch. The video was crystal clear, showing his face and even the license plate of the car he'd parked at the curb. I called Patricia immediately, even though it was early. She told me to call the police and send her a copy of the video. This time, a detective got involved. Detective Sarah Morrison from the Roseville Police Department came to my house that afternoon, reviewed the footage, and nodded grimly. "That's pretty cut and dried," she said. "We'll go have a conversation with Mr. Whitmore." Richard was arrested that evening and charged with vandalism and criminal trespass. The charges were misdemeanors, but they carried potential jail time and fines. More importantly, word spread through the neighborhood almost immediately. The story of the solar panel dispute had already made me semi-famous in Sunset Meadows, but this took it to another level. Most of my neighbors were appalled that things had escalated to criminal behavior. I started receiving apology visits from people who had supported the HOA's position in the beginning. Linda, the neighbor who complained about seeing my panels from her upstairs window, came by with a plate of cookies. "I feel terrible about all this," she said. "I had no idea it would go so far. What Deborah and Richard did was completely unacceptable." "I appreciate that," I said, accepting the cookies even though I had no intention of eating them. Who knew what she might have put in them? The case against Richard went to court in January. He pled guilty to the vandalism charge in exchange for the trespass charge being dropped. He was sentenced to 300 hours of community service, ordered to pay restitution for the damage to my garage door and mailbox, and given 2 years of probation. Deborah was conspicuously absent from the next several HOA meetings. Rumors swirled that she and Richard were thinking about moving. I hoped they would. The neighborhood would be better off without them. In February, I got a knock on my door on a Saturday afternoon. I opened it to find Tom, the new HOA president, standing there with an apologetic expression. "Hey Frank, you got a minute?" "Sure, what's up?" "I wanted to apologize on behalf of the board for everything you went through. The way Deborah handled that whole situation was completely out of line. We've been reviewing our policies, and we're actually going to amend our CCRs to explicitly acknowledge homeowners' rights under California's solar laws. We want to make sure this never happens to anyone else." "That's good to hear," I said, genuinely surprised. "And I wanted to ask you something. We've got an opening on the architectural committee. Would you be interested in joining? I think having someone with your perspective would be valuable." I almost laughed. The idea of me on the HOA board after everything that had happened was absurd. But looking at Tom's earnest face, I realized he was serious. "Let me think about it," I said, after he left. I actually did think about it. Part of me wanted nothing to do with the HOA ever again. But another part of me recognized that if I really wanted to prevent future homeowners from going through what I'd experienced, the best way to do that was from the inside. I called Tom the next day and accepted the position. My first architectural committee meeting was weird. There were 3 other members besides me. and they all treated me with a careful politeness that made it clear they'd been briefed on my history. We reviewed several applications that evening, mostly routine stuff like someone wanting to repaint their shutters and another person wanting to add a backyard deck. Then, we got to an application from a homeowner on the other side of the development who wanted to install solar panels. The room went quiet. Everyone looked at me. "Well," I said, "state law is clear. As long as the installation meets code requirements and doesn't violate any safety regulations, we have to approve it, even if the panels will be visible from the street." One of the other committee members asked nervously, "Even then, we can suggest placement options that might be more aesthetically pleasing, but we can't deny the application based on appearance alone." There was a pause, and then the committee chair, a pleasant woman named Susan, nodded. "Motion to approve the application." "Seconded," I said. The application was approved unanimously. Over the next few months, 3 more homeowners submitted solar panel applications. We approved all of them. Sunset Meadows was slowly becoming a more environmentally conscious community, and I like to think I had played a role in that. Deborah and Richard did eventually move. Their house went up for sale in March, and it sold within 2 weeks. I never saw them again, though I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that they'd moved to a community in Arizona. I hoped their new HOA was more tolerant of their particular brand of busybody tyranny than I had been. My solar panels continued to perform beautifully, generating more than enough electricity to power my home and feeding excess power back into the grid. My electric bills averaged about $30 a month, down from over $200 before the installation. Over time, the panels would more than pay for themselves, even accounting for the legal fees I'd incurred defending my right to keep them. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was knowing that I had stood up to bullies who tried to abuse their petty authority, and I had won. It was knowing that other homeowners in my community wouldn't have to face the same harassment I had endured. It was knowing that state law existed to protect important rights like renewable energy access, and that those laws meant something even when small-minded people tried to ignore them. One evening in late April, I was sitting on my back patio, enjoying the sunset and a cold beer, when my neighbor from the other side, a friendly guy named Marcus who I'd gotten to know over the past few months, called out over the fence. "Hey Frank, I've been thinking about getting solar panels myself. Think you could give me some advice on installers?" "Absolutely," I called back. "Come on over, I'll show you my setup." He came through the side gate, and we spent the next hour talking about kilowatt hours and panel efficiency and net metering. It was the kind of boring, technical conversation that I absolutely loved, and it felt good to share what I'd learned. As Marcus was leaving, he paused at the gate. "I heard about all the trouble you had with the HOA. That took guts, man. A lot of people would have just caved and taken the panels down." "I thought about it," I admitted, "but some things are worth fighting for." "Well, I'm glad you did. Made it easier for the rest of us." After he left, I went back to my patio and looked up at my roof, where the solar panels gleamed in the fading light. They weren't ugly. They were practical, efficient, and forward-thinking. They represented a better future, one where people took responsibility for their environmental impact and made smart choices about energy consumption. If Deborah Whitmore couldn't see that, it was her problem, not mine. The story of my battle with the HOA became something of a legend in Sunset Meadows. New homeowners would hear about it during neighborhood barbecues, usually with various embellishments and exaggerations. In some versions, I'd sued the HOA for millions of dollars. In others, Deborah had been arrested along with her husband. The truth was less dramatic but more satisfying. I had simply stood my ground, relied on the law, and refused to be bullied into giving up something I had every right to have. By summer, 7 homes in Sunset Meadows had solar panels, including Marcus's. There was talk of organizing a bulk purchase program to get better rates for future installations. The HOA board, under Tom's leadership, had become genuinely supportive of renewable energy initiatives, even discussing the possibility of installing solar panels on the community center. It was a complete transformation from the hostile environment I'd faced just months earlier, and it proved something I'd always believed. Most people are reasonable when given accurate information and proper leadership. Deborah had been an anomaly, a person who valued her own aesthetic preferences and sense of control over common sense and the law. Without her poisonous influence, the community was becoming what it should have been all along, a place where neighbors supported each other's choices and worked together toward common goals. I stayed on the architectural committee for 2 years. During that time, we approved dozens of solar panel applications, along with other environmentally friendly modifications like rain gardens, native plant landscaping, and electric vehicle charging stations. We updated the community guidelines to explicitly encourage sustainable practices, while still maintaining reasonable aesthetic standards. Eventually, I stepped down from the committee to focus on other things, but I'd accomplished what I set out to do. No homeowner in Sunset Meadows would ever face what I had faced. The precedent had been set, the policies had been changed, and the culture had shifted. Looking back on the whole experience, I wouldn't say I enjoyed it. The stress, the harassment, the legal fees, the vandalism, none of that was fun. But I learned something important about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult and uncomfortable. I learned that laws protecting individual rights only matter if people are willing to fight to enforce them. And I learned that communities are shaped by the people willing to step up and challenge injustice, even when that injustice comes in the petty form of an HOA board drunk on its own limited power. My solar panels are still up there on my roof, still generating clean electricity, still saving me money every month. They're visible from certain angles if you know where to look, and every time I see them, I smile, because they're not just solar panels. They're a reminder that Karen doesn't always get her way, that state law means something, and that sometimes the little guy wins, and that's worth more than any amount of electricity they could ever generate.